Welcome to the Catholic Midlife Podcast, where we address the challenges and the opportunities of midlife from a uniquely Catholic perspective. This is the time, my friends, for a deeper renewal of your Christian vocation. Come and enter into the freedom of Christ that allows you to be the person you were created to be, because there's an amazing, awesome, exciting next season of life waiting for you. Hello, and welcome to the Catholic Midlife Podcast. We are Karen and Curtis Herbert, your co-hosts.
Hi, everybody. Welcome aboard.
Curtis, do we have a listener comment this morning?
You mean a comment about our listeners?
Well, I wasn't thinking that, but is that what you're looking for?
Yeah. If you had a comment about our listeners, Karen, what would it be?
Wow. Okay. If I had a comment about our listeners, here's one thing that's really struck me. Every time I have had a conversation with a podcast listener, I've been really impressed with their character and really they're engaging not just with our podcast, but with a lot of things in their environment and in their culture to just invest in themselves, to move forward, to be with the Lord, to grow, to be the best person they can be. I'm really impressed. I think we have quality listeners.
Quality listeners. If you listen to the Catholic Midlife Podcast, you're a cut above.
You are. That's a good way to put it.
And speaking of a cut above, a way to have a high quality, thoughts, high quality experience, wisdom. Reframing is what we're talking about, getting to that higher quality of life. And why are we talking about reframing? What is reframing, Karen?
I like to think about reframing first using an analogy. So let's say you're walking through life and you're looking through a camera lens and you're seeing whatever you're seeing through this frame in the lens. It's your perspective. It's your point of view. Let's say you're a photographer and you're by the lake in Minnesota. You can pan out, you can get that wide picture view, take in the whole scene. You can zoom in closer and get the trees by the shore. You can zoom in really close, right, and get the wildflower, maybe the bug on the wildflower. Or you could totally shift your body and get a completely different picture.
One thing I'm realizing is that lens, that frame, it's pretty limited. I'm looking through the camera, and there could be things going on to my left and right. I could have no idea. Or I take a couple steps backward and step into a puddle or something.
Yeah, sometimes I've seen photographs, and I'm not even aware that I actually know where that is, because the way that it's framed isn't congruent with the perspective I had when I was there. And I'm thinking that photographers spend a lot of time deciding, how do I want to frame this scene? What's going to get me the picture that I'm going for, that'll get the response from the viewer that I want?
Well, unlike the photographer, I usually go through life and I'm not thinking about the frame. I'm just, there it is. I'm looking at what I'm looking. I can zoom in. I'm pretty good at that.
Yeah.
But that's how it is for me.
Pan in and pan out. Well, it's very similar. We are creating frames for what we see, we hear, we experience all day long. And you're right. We don't even realize the frames that we're creating for our experience. We just assume we're looking at this world through the right set of lenses.
And I would say, again, I'm good at zooming in. But panning out, that doesn't come to me automatically.
Yeah, that takes a little more effort.
Absolutely.
Well, I do believe, kind of like what you were saying earlier, Curtis, is that when you start to learn this skill of framing, reframing, panning in, panning out, you do realize that you might be missing some key pieces of information or some important perspectives because you haven't included that in your frame of reference. And reframing, basically, it's just questioning your frame, realizing what frame you have, and shifting so that you can look at a situation or a relationship or an experience from a different angle. And it usually reveals a lot of really great insights into that experience.
Okay, looking at the situation from a different angle, changing the frame. Okay, like what, for instance?
One example I really like is just from a children's story. I think we all know the story of the ugly duckling.
Ooh, yeah, that's
It's such
a
a
great
great
one.
story because here you have this young chick who looks really different from its peers, and he's surrounded by a certain kind of bird. And when he compares himself, he's like, well, I'm really ugly. I don't fit in. Until, of course, the end, when he meets the swans and discovers, wow, I'm actually a beautiful swan. And that's a reframe because all of a sudden in the story, we're seeing that bird from a totally different environment and in comparison to something else. So we have a whole different perspective and evaluation.
I love that story. It reminds me of the moose. So a moose is something that we often kind of make fun of. There's cartoons of the moose, and the moose looks really silly. It's wandering down the street. But if you ever see a moose in its native habitat, you see the moose in the forest and the lakes. It is a awesome, powerful, inspiring creature. It is amazing. They can do so many things. So the moose looks a lot different depending on the frame.
Right. They're pretty majestic and something to be, as you said, held in awe, for sure. Another example I like is you can reframe things just by asking different questions about it. So the questions you ask about something are themselves a frame. You could say, well, what is 5 plus 5? Or you could say, what two numbers add up to 10? And asking a different question is going to open up a different number of solutions. The second question has an infinite number of solutions. And even though they're both addition questions, their frame is different. And I like that. I think it's Albert Einstein who said something like, well, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend the first 55 minutes discovering what the right question is, because that's the most important. And once I have that, I can solve the problem.
Wow, that's a great quote. So we can be stuck in our frame, and often perhaps we have an answer.
Right.
And we could reframe by asking a different question.
People who are innovators or designers or scientists really need to be good reframers if they're going to be able to even identify the problem that they have.
Karen, there's a big neuroscience piece to this.
Really?
And as you know, I'm fascinated by the differences in the hemispheres of the brain, the right and the left hemispheres. And
I do know that.
one way that our brains work is our right hemisphere is looking at globally around us. It is perceiving. It's taking in all the information. Now, when it needs a more detailed or analytic take, or more very specific focus take, or a very abstract take, or it needs the language, it takes this information and it passes off what it sees as relevant to the left hemisphere. And the left hemisphere is very analytical, it's very confident, it's very sure of itself, it's very locked into this is how the world is, because it is designed for survival, for many things. It's very practical. And then if things are working right, the information goes back to the right hemisphere and you get a take on it. So often the right and the left hemispheres have a different take on the same situation. And we inherently have different perspectives that are available to us. However, so often we're dialing in on just one of them, especially when the left hemisphere kind of seizes control and says, oh, this is how it is.
That is so interesting. I mean, could you say that even that the right hemisphere is kind of the pan out and the left hemisphere is the pan in, detail oriented?
Yeah, sure. Something like that.
Something like that. Can I give another example?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I was reading about these researchers who were trying to get people to save money. Like, how can we support and encourage people to save money for the long term? So there was this program people could sign up for where a certain amount of money would be automatically deposited into a savings account. And at first, they framed it as a monthly amount, say $150 per month. And they were getting a certain number of signups, but they wanted more. So when they reframed this as, say, a daily amount, you're saving $5 per day, for some reason, that frame overcame a lot of the psychological hurdles, and they quadrupled the number of people who signed up for their program. So there's this idea of reframing also gets a different response from others or from ourselves because you're looking at it differently. And I guess that's why in those commercials, everybody's like, for pennies a day, you can do this, or for the cost of a cup of coffee, because it frames it in a very approachable way.
That's a great example. I'm a little disappointed there was no psychological trickery involved, but it was a straight up reframe, and it seemed to be working.
Exactly. But it tells you that, let's say you wanted to save more money and you were struggling to. You could say, well, how am I framing this? That might be an obstacle to my goal here.
How about this one? I failed.
Oh, ouch. That's very, very common experience. That's one that's like ripe for a reframe. You could say, well, there is no failure. There's only feedback. Or failure is a learning experience. And that's really reframing failure as an opportunity to learn, to grow, to improve. And the research shows people who are successful and happy, even if they don't realize it, they use this reframe a lot. They've internalized it.
Failure is feedback.
Failure is
There
feedback.
is no failure, only learning.
Exactly.
And that's our left hemisphere, by the way, telling us, it's locking us into this very absolute situation. It's giving us the is identity. I'm a failure. That was a fail.
Right. Pass or fail. So it's kind of black and white.
Yes. And those are all sort of little flags that, hey, how about a reframe?
Yeah. Yeah. How about a little pan out? Okay, here's my last example, but I just like it, so I have to say it. A lot of jokes are reframes. Many jokes are reframes. And there's kind of this classic example. It comes from one of the Pink Panther movies. Did you ever see those, Curtis?
Oh, yeah.
I like them. They're so funny. Okay, so here's this scene where Inspector Clouseau is walking up to the hotel clerk, and he says, "Does your dog bite?" And the hotel clerk says, "No." So Clouseau bows down to pet this dog by the clerk. "Nice doggy." And it bites his hand.
Oh.
And Clouseau says, "I thought you said your dog didn't bite." And the hotel clerk says, "That is not my dog." That's not my dog.
That is not my dog.
Yeah. So you're expecting a certain perspective. And at the end, there's a reframe. There's more information.
Right. That's Clouseau saying, "Do you have a room?" Yes. A room?
Is it?
A what?
I can't do that.
Yeah, they make fun of his accent. Well, product designers, they're great reframers. They have to anticipate how their customers are going to use things.
I think writers have to be framers to frame a scene. Anyone involved in communicating a message is going to be framing and reframing to get people to hear their message.
Absolutely. And of course, Karen, as coaches, the reframe is so important because we get dialed into these thoughts, beliefs, opinions, whatever they are, that aren't true. And a reframe is called for.
Yeah. It's very easy to get into this mindset that my outlook is really the only way to look at something, whether it's a problem or a conflict or a situation. And very often we're just not going to see solutions or possibilities or creative approaches until we've reframed and found a broader picture.
Karen, going back to your camera analogy, we often don't realize as we go through our day that we can choose the frame. We can choose how to
Right.
frame our experience, the situation, what we're hearing, what we're experiencing. These can almost always be reframed somehow, just like the direction the camera is pointing. We can zoom in, we can pan out,
Yeah.
which may be a little harder. These are options for us because the truth is more complex
Yeah.
than just that one little thing that's dead center of our focal point. There's more to see and more to consider.
And ultimately, the question is this perspective helping me? Or is it serving me? Or is somehow it keeping me stuck or keeping me limited? And what's going to be the best frame for this situation for me?
The point is that we can reframe to a true or a more true perspective that's going to help us in the way that we think we need help at that time.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a situation, Curtis, and maybe you can just run through some possible frames that I could look at it in.
Okie doke.
Let's say you're a student and you have a student experience. You do poorly on a test. You've done poorly on a test. How can you frame that?
Oh, that's easy. Oh, it's the end of the world. Oh, I'm so stupid. I'm going to fail. I'm never going to be a blah, blah, blah. Or I could say, I messed this up. Now I have to go a totally different direction. I can't be an accountant anymore. Now I have to be a bookseller or something. Or if it's a math test, you might say, well, I'm just not very good at math. So that's how it is. I'm just going to get terrible grades in this math course. And there you go. Or say, I'm really full at this. You've really resonated with my experience, right?
You know about this.
Yeah. Yeah. I can look for performance things and kind of make excuses. Oh, it was an off day. Well, I could have studied an extra day, but I was too lazy. I can start to introduce these shortcuts instead of engaging the bigger picture.
Okay. So why would you, the student, want to reframe or choose a frame for this experience?
Well, in the first place, I'm probably miserable.
Yeah.
And I'm not taking any constructive action in this situation. If I reframe successfully to embrace something that's true and helpful, then I can respond appropriately. Now, it's within the realm of possibility that I'm in the wrong major. So I can calmly step back and look at the other situation. And if I'm panning out, I would start talking to smart people that I trusted at getting the right information to get an informed perspective. Or this is more likely, I can simply acknowledge that I didn't do well and I'm missing something, because I could normally take a test and do, okay, what did I miss? And that starts a good inquiry that could point in a lot of different directions.
Sure. So if your frame really is, there is no failure, only feedback, you might ask yourself, well, what is the actual feedback information I'm getting here? There's some way to learn that's being expected that somehow I'm not accessing, or there's some way of studying that obviously I didn't do in order to meet these expectations.
It's really true that if you're thinking I failed at X, that the reframes often involved, it's not failure, it's learning and what comes next.
And that's ultimately then what spurs to action and taking some kind of constructive action.
The student, me in this case, wanted to reframe because, look, there's a more true and a more powerful way of looking at this situation. Instead of being demotivated by my thoughts and circumstances, looking for excuses or whatever, there's a more powerful perspective. And you'll notice, by the way, these perspectives usually involve having more agency.
Right.
Shifting from the doom and gloom back to me.
Yeah.
And moving my emotional state so that, hey, I'm ready for the action to come back to me, ready to take some kind of constructive step. Okay, Karen, now it's your turn. Are you ready?
Give it to me.
Okay. My responsibilities are too overwhelming. What if you're sitting around and you're having one of those days or one of those weeks,
it's all
and that's
crashing
your
down.
thought? It's too overwhelming.
Right. Well, I think this is a great frame to start to question a little bit and introduce some other frames. So does having these responsibilities mean I'm too overwhelmed? Or does having these responsibilities actually mean I have a lot of things I care about and people that I'm invested in, and this is really important in my life? Or how about my responsibilities create a lot of great activity and connection in my life? I'm not overwhelmed. I'm engaged in life. Or I could say, well, I'm kind of saying that it's bad to be overwhelmed, but is it really bad to be overwhelmed? It's actually good that I'm overwhelmed. Feeling overwhelmed gives me information, and it's a good opportunity to reevaluate and reprioritize my responsibilities.
I can see some of these reframes are inviting you to take a different perspective. For instance, you might decide that, wow, I'm super engaged, but I am super stressed.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, oh, okay, well, that's a different problem to solve than being overwhelmed.
Yes. And so a lot of the reframe is just, if you can get yourself to start thinking differently, you can see different things about your situation. You could ask, well, what responsibilities am I talking about really? How do I know those are truly my responsibilities? Am I choosing to feel responsible for something that actually I need to let go of? That's not my responsibility.
I like those reframes. They're focusing on the responsibility piece.
Yeah.
Some of those questions focus on the overwhelming part, but you're shifting the focus to, oh, my responsibilities are too overwhelming. Well, what are those, and are they mine? What's on my list? It's creating a new direction.
Sure. You could also question the overwhelm frame. Well, too overwhelming compared to what? I mean, what's my benchmark? What do I feel like is a good amount of overwhelm? And also, ultimately, I get to choose how I feel. So what is it about my situation that's causing me to choose to feel overwhelmed? How do I know the overwhelm is coming from the responsibilities? And if I wasn't feeling overwhelmed, well, what would I choose to feel instead? That can help me think about, from the feeling piece, what it's really connected to.
Right. So this is a little more to it than bouncing back after a bad test.
Yep.
You might be focused on getting out of a negative funk, which can be a fine place to visit, not a great place to live, and take some new information. They tend to engage you as an agent. And just, Karen, the point of these reframes is there's a equally or perhaps more true and more powerful way of looking at the situation. So we don't reframe. This isn't positive thinking or avoidance. We're not trying to wish something away. We are changing our perspective to ask better questions, or to take some steps back and get to a place where we can embrace our agency.
Sure, because like if there's 100 perspectives on a particular situation and you're stuck in one and you can't get out, that is an extremely limiting position to be. We have to be able to take those other perspectives and see these are also true as well. And if I'm going to be able to make the choices I want to make in this situation, I have to be able to access more than one sliver perspective on a situation.
And there's another point I want to make, Karen, that I think is maybe not so obvious, but we often approach life, we just suck it up.
Yeah.
We can be one-trick ponies. Mm-hmm. Well, I feel overwhelmed, but I'm going to put my head down. I'm going to grind it out. I'm going to stay late. Or we can tolerate. oh, well, whatever. Yeah, I'm overwhelmed, but now I'm just going to do the next thing. And those are strategies that we often use. We're adults and that's fine. But if we're a one-trick pony, we're using strategies that are not energizing. They're not really empowering, when instead we could be reframing to find other true things that are more helpful to us.
I think that's a really good point, Curtis, because we have patterns of frames, patterns of ways that we look at things that are pretty ingrained, and we can become very used to just automatically digging into that particular frame because we have a pattern. And reframing can help us to start to counter those patterns, especially because sometimes, you know what, they're just not helping us.
When you're pushing through, when you're grinding it out, when you're feeling crushed, you are down in the dumps, so often we have other possibilities that are within reach. It may not always be easy, but they are possible for us. And reframing is a new strategy or a different strategy as opposed to just sucking it up, just being responsible, just doing your duty all the time.
Just blaming other people, whatever it is.
Oh, yeah, that's
just
my
beating
favorite.
yourself up, blah, whatever it is. Yes. Excellent. I think we're probably on track to wrap up this episode. And before we go, I just want to encourage our extremely impressive quality listeners, all of you. We are so thankful to be in a relationship with you and to know you and to connect through this podcast. We'd love to have more people like you in our community. So reach out and invite other impressive, quality, amazing Catholics to listen to this podcast.
Thanks for being here with us. The Catholic Midlife Podcast is for anyone that wants to receive the abundance of life that God has for each one of us. Take a moment right now to tell a friend about us.